Yevgeny Prigozhin, the boss of the Wagner Group mercenary group, believes the city of Bakhmut, or Artyomsk as the Russians call it, will soon fall into the hands of Vladimir Putin. The paramilitary gang is claimed to have surrounded soldiers Volodymyr Zelensky, making it difficult to get in or out of the city. To this day, the battle for Bakhmut has almost completely destroyed the Ukrainian army, Prigozhin said in a statement on Wednesday, quoted by Russia Today, Thursday. However, he explained, his own Wagner group had also taken a serious blow. He called the sacrifices made by his group for Russia worth it. He called the battle the general engagement of the entire conflict in which Wagner's forces were pitted against the Ukrainian armed forces and foreign units were installed in them. The victory of his army would be a turning point and a historic event, securing Russia's victory, Prigozhin predicted. The Russian army itself will be left on the chessboard, and all other pieces will be removed, he predicted. Even if PMC Wagner is crushed in a Bakhmut meat grinder but taking Ukrainian soldiers with us, it means we have accomplished our historic mission. The fight for Bakhmut has emerged as one of the most intense and bloody engagements of armed conflict in Ukraine, with both sides reportedly suffering heavy casualties. Western officials claim the city is of no strategic military value, but Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky vowed to defend it as long as possible after proclaiming it a stronghold. The Ukrainian leader made clear to the Associated Press earlier this week that if Russia seized Bakhmut, his government would be under international and domestic pressure to seek peace with Moscow. Our people will feel tired, he told the news agency. Our people will encourage me to compromise with them. The battle for the city was the longest fighting during the Russian invasion in February 2022. Both sides have also sacrificed tens of thousands of soldiers. Newsweek reported, for months, the town of Bakhmut was one of the hottest parts of the 965 kilometers long front. Ian Stubbs, senior military advisor in the UK delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, spoke to Ukrinform on the sidelines of the Security Cooperation Forum in Vienna on Wednesday. Stubbs said Moscow troops and their fellow Wagner Group mercenaries took heavy casualties in the intensive fighting in the Donetsk region. Over the past week, we have seen intensifying fighting as Russia continues its offensive in the Donbass, Stubbs added. Russia suffered a very high casualty rate. Since May last year, between 20,000 and 30,000 Wagner troops and regular Russian troops have been killed or wounded in the area around Bakhmut alone. The number of lost human lives is very large for a total territorial advance of only about 25 kilometers, he said. Such casualties mean over 800 Russian personnel were killed or wounded for every kilometer traveled, most of them Wagner fighters, Stubbs added. Oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, who owns and operates the Wagner Group, is finding it increasingly difficult to resupply what he calls meat grinders in eastern Ukraine. Everyone can see the truth. The Russian military and defense industry failed in Ukraine, said Stubbs. Neither Russia nor Ukraine regularly publish casualty figures in the war. Moscow has only confirmed the deaths of around 6,000 soldiers who fought in Ukraine. Kyiv claims to have killed more than 162,000 Russians since February 24, 2022. Meanwhile, Western estimates range up to around 200,000 Russians killed and wounded. Western officials also say Ukraine may have lost up to 100,000 soldiers killed in more than a year of fighting. The fighting in Bakhmut has now lasted more than 7 months. The victims are believed to be equally tall on both sides. The Ukrainian government has come under fire for its refusal to surrender the city of Bakhmut, although Russian units in the vicinity are slowly encroaching. President Volodymyr Zelensky and top officials say Bakhmut is being detained and strengthened for military, not political reasons. Russian capture of Bakhmut will pave the way for further attacks on the cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk in the Donbass. These were the two main objectives of Russia's spring offensive, which sought to complete the occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Former Ukrainian Defense Minister Andriy Zagorotnyk told Newsweek Kyiv's military leadership truly believed Bakhmut was useful. This is not a political decision, this is a military decision. I believe it is very difficult, but there are no easy decisions in war. We cannot fully understand the details because the decision was made using all available intelligence and operational campaign planning details, Zagorodniak said. However, it is clear that, unless the remaining Russian capabilities are unblocked at Bakhmut, they will quickly focus on other areas of the Donbass, possibly impacting the large number of civilians living there and possibly preparations for future counteroffensives. The commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, said in a statement posted to the military's Telegram channel on Wednesday, "The enemy continues to make unsuccessful attempts to encircle the city and move forward." Ukrainian fighters, Syrsky added, fought off intense enemy pressure. Thanks to their work, enemy tanks, IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, and ammunition depots took to the air. The decisive actions of our soldiers exhausted and demoralized the enemy and brought our victory closer, said Syrsky. While fighting the Russian advance along the front, the Ukrainian forces were preparing their own spring counterattack. Presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak said last week that Kyiv expected its efforts to start within the next 2 months. Ukrainian leaders hoped that their units by then would be reinforced by heavy and light armor from NATO, as Ukrainian crews are currently being trained in NATO countries. How much U.S. money has been burned to help Ukraine fight the Russian invasion? It is estimated that Ukraine will be powerless against the Russian invader if there is no help from the European Union and the United States, U.S. The U.S., one of the countries most keen to call for resistance, even poured out the most aid funds for Volodymyr Zelensky's troops. In a financial oversight hearing, it was stated that so far the funds that have been disbursed by Uncle Sam's country amount to $113 billion United States dollars or RP, 1,699 trillion. Exchange rate of RP, 5,043 US dollar. The last U.S. aid to increase Ukraine's arsenal was disbursed as much as $29.3 billion US dollars in February 2023. Most of the money that the U.S. Congress has earmarked for helping the government in Kiev has actually been funneled into the military-industrial complex, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee said in an oversight hearing on Wednesday. Texas Republican Representative Michael McCall said of the $113 billion allocated, in the 4 additions, about 60% will go to American troops, American workers, and to modernize American supplies. In fact, only 20% of the funds go directly to the Ukrainian government, in the form of direct budget assistance. McCall is a staunch supporter of arming Ukraine, and insists his oversight of the aid is not intended to weaken or call into question the importance of support for Kiev, but to inform American taxpayers how their money is being spent. Witnesses at Wednesday's hearing on oversight, transparency, and accountability of Ukrainian aid included the Permanent Acting or Inspector General at the Pentagon, Department of State, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. All 3 were featured in a Wall Street Journal report last month about American auditors going to Ukraine to ensure weapons, equipment, and cash were not routed for unwanted uses. They told McCall on Wednesday that, so far, there had been no proved cases of diverting U.S. aid. Every dollar counts, McCall said, arguing oversight would increase the efficiency and effectiveness of Ukraine's funding, in the interests of the U.S. He also noted that multinational consulting firm Deloitte is working with the Ukrainian government to verify the release of U.S. cash sent to shore up Kiev's state budget. "I don't think the U.S. has ever been involved in anything like this," McCall said later in the hearing, referring to the NATO arms pipeline that goes to Ukraine via Poland. Moscow has repeatedly warned the West that supplying Ukraine with weapons and equipment will only prolong the war and increase the risk of a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. The U.S. and its allies insist that sending more than $100 billion worth of weapons to Kiev does not make them parties to the conflict, even as what many public officials describe as a proxy war they must lose with Russia. Ukraine spends 130 billion hryvnia, $3.5 billion US dollars a month on its military, said Finance Minister Sergei Marchenko. In a meeting with the country's European Business Association, EBA, on Wednesday, Marchenko also revealed that Ukraine's budget receives 80 billion hryvnia, nearly $2.2 billion US dollars, in revenue every month. The main task is to create conditions for military financing, Marchenko said while disclosing the amount, according to the EBA press service. Last week, Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovnaya Rada, adopted a law on increasing spending on defense by more than $14.6 billion. Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has previously determined that the Cabinet of Ministers proposes to allocate additional funds for payments to the military, as well as the purchase of military and special equipment. According to him, the money will be allocated through the support of Western partners. When approving the draft 2023 budget last November, Parliament set aside more than 1 trillion hryvnia, 31 billion United States dollars, for the armed forces and national security, which account for 43% of all spending, or 18.2% of the country's GDP. Ukraine's budget deficit this year is expected to reach a record $38 billion. The government plans to cover the deficit by using Western foreign aid. Last month, the United States announced $12 billion in additional aid to Kiev, including a $2 billion arms package and another $10 billion to support Ukraine's government's energy costs and budget. According to U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Washington has provided nearly $50 billion in support since last year, much of it destined for weapons. Meanwhile, the European Union in February approved an additional €545 million, $590 million, in military aid to Ukraine, bringing its total support for Kiev's forces to €3.6 billion, $3.8 billion. Since the start of the war, the EU and its member states have reportedly provided $50 billion, $54 billion, in direct support to Ukraine.